Well, we have an extra blessing this afternoon. I'm delighted to introduce Senator John Warner, who literally is one of those people that doesn't need any introduction. He has such a distinguished career of public service, Secretary of the Navy, many years in the U.S. Senate, Chair of the Armed Services Committee, and a leader on the Hill and now off the Hill in terms of energy security, climate change, and those interrelated issues. I did notice something I didn't know in his background, that at one point was a cattle rancher, and which I'm told helped him deal with the old bulls on the hill.
I was able to deal with them until I became one of them. I'm so pleased to be here. I didn't mean to parachute in before this distinguished panel, but a good friend, Sharon Burke, apparently leaked my name and said that, maybe I could say a few words. I guess I'm here to, first and foremost, just say thank you to each and every one of you. Many of you have traveled long distances to come and participate in this very important forum. I've worked with Howard Baker when I first went to the Senate 30 years ago. He was my leader, and today he still acts as if he's my leader. And there's no doubt about that. And then, of course, the laboratories, as former chairman of the Armed Services Committee, as I was 3 times, we did a lot of work with the laboratories. So I think this symposium is put together under the auspices of just about as fine a sponsorship as you could obtain for such a panel and the convening. Now, I stand here simply as one who fought for 14 months, my last 14 months in the United States Senate, along with a very brave Senator, Joe Lieberman. And it was the Lieberman-Warner bill, which was the only climate change bill that got to the floor in the last Congress. And it was only there a short time, but it was a long and perilous route of going through committee, and I was the only Republican on the committee that voted for it, and then getting it to the floor where we were beginning to get some traction. We would never, in my judgment, have gotten it passed. My only regret is they didn't give us a few more days, because we had engendered enough interest among the pros and the cons in the Senate to come together and have a good old-fashioned Senate debate, which could have been hammered on, and it would have laid a foundation. But that was not the choice of the then administration, and the bill was taken off the floor. I don't regret it. I don't regret a bit in working on it. But it instilled in me a desire to press on. And I want to talk about just 3 basic things. One is press on. Sometimes the hills and the mountains and the valleys and the pits in this long, perilous journey look to be insurmountable. But there's got to be a band of brothers and sisters such as yourselves and other groups that are going to continue to persevere. I'm under strict embargo on the ethics code not to get involved in anything with regard to Congress, but as a citizen I read the papers and I see the players, and I commend the President and the members of Congress who are coming to grips with this issue as best they can under extraordinary circumstances. We've got to stop to think that the United States, and indeed much of the world, is going through a most incredible, if not unprecedented, economic situation. We don't know fully how we're going to work our way out, except that we have the conviction that we will get out, and I'm sure we will, somewhere, somehow. So why take on another issue like the combination of, and I want to stress this, the combination of greater energy independence for the United States, some solutions to work towards the reductions that are needed in the area of climate change, the CO2 and other contributing causes. And thirdly, and the one that finally got me involved in this, the impact on America's national security commitments today and tomorrow in the future. I say it's a 3-legged stool, and they're interdependent on one another. For these reasons: 1, so much of the erratic climate change that we're experiencing today seems to, unfortunately, be falling on those areas of the world where the nations are quite fragile in terms of their success to have a sovereign nation, and they can be destabilized very easily by prolonged drought. We're seeing this certainly in the Darfur region, by high water that might come about as a consequence of the increase predicted in the ocean levels as they rise, by mass migrations brought on by any number of causes, all sorts of things that can topple a sovereign nation and then leave it, that is the land and the people, at the mercy of those who come in to take over. And vacuums are soon filled in those situations. So it's not in our interest to have the people that come in begin to use that area geographically for purposes of exploitation, for purposes of perhaps terrorism, and other things that we have seen in nations which have lost their sovereignty and their ability to govern and care for their people. Time and time again, in my final years of the Senate, very distinguished retired members of the United States military would come to my office, men and women that I'd worked for years. And they were volunteering to go out and talk about the need to look at the roles and missions. That's the role of the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, and the Marines, now and in the future, and see how those missions could be impacted by these variables in climate change and other problems, and energy shortages, which also can really topple a nation. And I became convinced there was something to it. And I put into law a provision, which fortunately Sharon Burke put in her symposium the other day, which said to the Department of Defense, begin to plan for the future now as to the contingencies that might occur, which might require further additions over and above what you foresee for the men and women of the armed forces. And that they're doing. I'm pleased to see that. We had a wonderful commander in the Navy, a fine lady who's what we call in the Navy a real ship captain, and she's been detailed to work on that, and believe me, that woman has got a dedication and the support of the Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, to impact the future planning and budget requirements of the Department of Defense, to have in there some insurance to meet such contingencies that might come about in the future. So that's underway. The other thing, and I think something that I can bring to this discussion, not only today, but I've been privileged to address a number of forums similar to this taking place in the nation's capital, and that is to get the message out. We come together at these forums, eminently well-qualified, skilled people, talk, exchange our views, but so often there may be a report written or a synopsis, but it somehow doesn't get correlated with all the other good work done by comparable symposiums and put into a vehicle by means of which the American public can have the benefit of your shared wisdom. Now, if there's one thing I do understand, and I say this without any sense of humility, having been elected 5 consecutive times in a state with 8 million people, I know a little bit about how to communicate with the public. And one is their attention is often fairly short, and you better get that message down and be able to direct it in such a way that they can absorb it, or at least put it in some written form, in not just English language, but language they can understand. Not a whole lot of acronyms and a whole lot of tables and a whole lot of charts and a whole lot of diagrams, but put it down so that they can understand it. Because I tell you, my dear friends, as I travel around my state and elsewhere in America today, I'm working for a foundation to try and do an outreach program. In other words, let's get out of the nation's capital, go out into the heartland of America, convene forums, bring in military experts, climate experts, energy experts, and kind of talk about the issues, not pushing them in exact directions, but explain the importance of getting their views, having them talk among themselves, energize a dialogue, and try and learn a little bit and bring it back to Washington. Now, the public are interested in this subject, and they're beginning to see that if they don't do something, then they've denied to their children and their grandchildren many of the pleasures that they enjoyed on this magnificent planet. But we've got to be dead honest with them and explain it so they can understand it and maintain that credibility. Now, one of the things that troubles me is that both of us, you and I, all of us together, watch these television ads of these very attractive individuals that dance out on the stage and say clean coal technology is just around the corner. And there it is, and we're going to have clean coal. When I came to the Senate 30 years ago, Senator Byrd of West Virginia called me into his office, and he explained how our two states were together and how the coal seams in my state went into his state, and his coal seams came into mine. He said, now we're going to get all the money we possibly can to try and promote clean coal technology. And we did it, because he happened to be chairman of the Appropriations Committee. That helped a little bit. But we did it, and I say not just the two of us, but the Senate really came to grips with the then problem of SOx and NOx and all of the clean air situation. I remember the clean air bill. It went to the floor. It came out of the committee. I was on the Environment and Public Committee at that time. And we debated it for weeks. We weren't really getting very far. And Senator Mitchell, who was a brilliant leader, began a series of meetings in his office, bringing in one or two senators at a time and saying, all right, what is your problem with this legislation, and how can we possibly write this bill to meet your requirements? Now, I'm not talking about politics or money or all those things that, earmarks and stuff like that. What is it about this bill? Mitchell was brilliant. He put together a whole new bill. And one day, I was part of the little inner circle that worked on him, Senator Moynihan, Senator Chafee, others. And he said, okay, we got it. And he went down and he pulled that bill on the floor off like this and put his bill down. We debated it for a couple of days, and that became the Clean Air Act. And it did work. Now, that was through determined perseverance. And we've got to replicate that situation today. I hope somehow the issues on the Hill, the bills, certainly the House has moved out, the Senate, big question mark. I won't say anything further on that. But somehow we've got to work on legislation. Industry needs it. Environmentalists need it. America needs it. The person in the street would feel very proud to see a piece of legislation which, as we say as an old Marine, gives us a beachhead. We're on it. We're landed. Now, it may take another piece of legislation and maybe another to keep working. But the determination is to eventually succeed in our basic goals of achieving how best to indeed get clean coal burning technology. Get the wind that we all think and listen to the TV ads is so simple. Well, it's not that simple. You look at the cost of transmission lines, the cost of the tax benefits that they have to bring this forward, and a lot of other renewable energy things. We've got to be truthful with the Republic. It's a long, hard slug. But because of people like you, I'm convinced we'll get there. Keep your head down, keep working, and we'll eventually achieve it. It may not be all this year, may not be all next year, but we have no alternative to put America in a position to lead. L-E-A-D, lead. Thank you.
I think we all understand why there was re-election after re-election. Terry?
Well, thank you very much for those remarks. I think very inspiring to what this group is about. And speaking of this group, we're going to move on to our next panel. And we've seen a lot of the pictures of these systems diagrams and boxes and arrows, and what's the reality is there are people in those boxes who have their own interests, goals, aspirations, challenges, and those are really the stakeholder domains. Those are the components of this system that make it real. And what we've tried to do in this panel is to really capture some of the experts that really understand those stakeholder domains to discuss those aspects. And we're just thrilled to have Dr. Arnold Vedlitz as the chair of this panel. Arnie holds the Bob Bullock Chair in Government and Public Policy at and is director of the Institute of Science and Technology and Public Policy at the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M University. He's written extensively in the area of environmental policy, including a recent book published in the MIT Press. Now, all of this is pretty impressive stuff, but what really got me is that you have to know Arnie actually once played backup for Bo Diddley. Everything else pales in my mind. But anyway, please welcome Arnie, who will introduce the panel and conduct this session.
Thanks, Terry. Les, is this your BlackBerry? Just don't forget about it. I want to thank Les and the first panel for doing an excellent job of kind of setting the important systemic nature and holistic approach that's going to be necessary to solve this problem. And as Terry said, our panel's role now is to drill a little deeper into some of the key domain areas that make up this complex system. And we have a great panel for doing that today. To my left is Dr. Bob Simon. Bob is the staff director of the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. And Bob is going to kind of set the basic parameters for us on the public policy issues and the public policy domains that we are facing right now. Some of the things, Senator, building on your comments that are going on right now that are so important to us. And then Sharon Burke, the Vice President for National Security at the Center for a New American Security, is going to discuss the security implications of these energy and climate change policy options that we're going to be facing. And then Bracken Hendricks, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, will take a look and talk about the job and employment imperatives in this energy climate change solutions realm. I like the way some of the earlier speakers talked about risk landscapes and solution environments and so on, and that's what Bracken and others of our panel are going to be focusing on. And then finally, Dr. Tony Janetos. Tony is the director of the Joint Global Change Research Initiative, and Tony's going to lay out the important environmental and natural resources context for these proposed system solutions. So we're going to drill deeper. We're going to talk about the various stakeholders, their conflicts, potential areas of cooperation, and how to go about building common solutions. And Bob, to start setting the tone for us.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by stating something that should be very obvious. It's a tremendous privilege, Senator, to appear in any context associated with you on this. And it's a little intimidating, too. I can certainly speak for myself. I can't speak on behalf of the United States Senate. My comments aren't necessarily on behalf of Senator Bingaman, the chairman of the committee, but it's a great pleasure to be here today. And so let's just get started. The main themes I want to cover here are things that I think are pretty well known to everybody in the room. Pretty much the science relating to climate change and the climate crisis is pretty much settled as far as the scientists are concerned. The second point I'm going to make is that the public still hasn't fully come to grips with the scale of a problem or the scale of the solution. That fact translates, I think, into a substantial challenge for public policy. And we've made a start, but we've got a long way to go. So let me just start with the science. I'm not going to give a science lecture here. I think the bottom line comes from an excellent précis that the National Academy of Sciences has put out, and here's the basic sentence. Despite remaining unanswered questions, we know enough to get started. And there are remaining unanswered questions, and I think it's important if we're talking to the public to be honest about that, because other people will tell them. and it will tend to confuse them because the public sometimes thinks that science is all one monolith, all scientists are the same, and golly, if they all don't happen to agree with each other, something must be terribly wrong. And so here are some of the live issues. Obviously, we've got good global level models. We don't have good regional level models. Attributing a specific event to climate change is a little shaky on the scientific side. It's important for people to understand the uncertainties that remain kind of go in both directions. It's not just like it might not be as bad as you think. The third point here, it may be a hell of a lot worse than you think. And understanding the potential for abrupt climate change is a key area of scientific uncertainty that's certainly worth acknowledging. And then, of course, you know, science and society and politics all kind of mesh together in this topic. And our models and our ability to understand how population growth and economic development and land use and other activities are going to change over time is still pretty rudimentary. And that's an important part of the equation. I think it's important to acknowledge those. None of those gets us away or fundamentally changes the reality that we do know enough to get started. In terms of talking to the public about this, and in terms of getting the public engaged, getting them convinced about the scale of the problem, we've made some bit of a start on that. You can show pictures like this to people, which is a composite photographs of outer space. I can show this to my mom, and she said, geez, 1979 versus 2003, I can see a difference. And that's a global difference. I mean, okay, something is changing, and that's important. And the reality is visible on the ground. You can go to Alaska. Here's a building that's constructed on permafrost. As the permafrost melts, you can see a real difference. And it's no accident that two of the more engaged senators on climate issues in the past have been Ted Stevens from Alaska and Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. They can see the effects of climate change in a very dramatic way because, as we all know, polar regions are warming fastest. Of course, if you can find the ground, and this is one prediction of what sea level rise might do to the topography of Florida, and I think the second one goes very much to the point that Senator Warner was making, that a sea level rise of about 1.5 meters basically washes away 16% of Bangladesh, and you have millions of people, 17 million people, living in those areas. Over there, that would become I have a pointer here somewhere. And one of the interesting things that's going on is India is spending a couple $2 billion a year to build a fence because they can see around the corner at this problem, and they actually don't have room for another 17 million people. And that is a tremendous, and that's just one example, but I think a very graphic example of some of the international security issues that are looming at us. Obviously, as everyone in this room knows, there are two basic questions that we have to address. One is the mitigation question: what can we do to prevent things from happening? And then, some of the change is obviously programmed in, and we're just simply going to have to adapt to it. And those frame some very important public policy choices. When we talk about trying to deal with mitigation, energy obviously looms very large, and energy policy looms very large. The greatest chunk of this pie graph comes from energy-related carbon dioxide in the United States, and many of the other wedges here, even methane, nitrous oxide, high global warming potential gases, they're also to some degree bound up also in the energy system. The next largest system in the country that contributes to this, mostly on the nitrous oxide and methane side, is agriculture. So between energy and agriculture, you've discovered two huge pieces of a society and politics that are implicated in all of this. Future paths for energy, depending on how we craft our energy future, will have a major impact on the climate future and the climate problem we'll be dealing with. This is not the world's best graphic on this point, but you can see that between now and 2030, emissions are going to go up around the world. And if you look between the two charts, you see the biggest rise, of course, is the United States, but even bigger, China. And China is, as everybody knows, is slated to surpass us. And those growing emissions of greenhouse gases are very much a consequence of growing energy use. This is data from the International Energy Agency. And we can see that in just about every sector of society, energy use is going to be growing between now and 2050. And along with those, we see that there will be growing carbon dioxide emissions from energy production and use, again, in every sector of industry and society. And if we're going to do something about the problem, we have to change very dramatically from the third bar to one of the fourth or fifth bar here, which is the business as usual case, to some other case. And I'll make a comment about these further two bars. The fourth bar, the so-called labeled the ACT map in this IEA analysis, was simply what you would have to do so that in the year 2050, you are just dead even with 2005 emissions. So you're not actually making any cuts. You're just kind of in a world that's going to have 9 billion people in it. You're just kind of treading water. That's what you have to do with the world population group. And the blue map is what you have to do to get to a 50% reduction. And I will simply make the observation that's the case they looked at. If you look at anybody who's ask scientists, what kind of reductions do we need to talk about? People aren't talking about 50%. They're talking about 80% reductions. So we're talking about, in order to stabilize global warming, some very vast changes in our energy system, sort of across the board in every sector between now and 2050. And if we just look at, some of the things that people are talking about, we're talking about some things that as you progressively dig into and dive deeper and carve into emissions, costs go up and uncertainty goes up, because at the end of this chart where we're talking about the technology spectrum of costs, that's a very large error bar, because in most cases those are very nascent technologies. We don't know if they're going to work or not. We don't know what they will cost or not. So they may be relatively inexpensive, or they may be relatively expensive. But I think that if we're going to talk to the public about what needs to happen, I think we do have to sort of be upfront and acknowledge them that, look, we're not all going to make money on this deal. This is going to be something that's going to take a tremendous amount of public investment. It is eminently worth doing. It is absolutely worth doing, absolutely necessary to do. But it's not going to be very easy. And if you just pick the electric generation sector, you don't even need to look at this kind of busy graphic, legend on the right-hand side. All you need to do is sort of just look at the color coding of this chart. Okay, the first three bars represent where we're headed on business as usual, and to get to the last bar, which is a 50% reduction, the thing that you notice, it's an utterly different color code. Okay, we have to have a revolutionary transformation of the electricity sector just to get to 50% emissions. So that's a huge challenge that's ahead of us. And of course, we have no time, because energy infrastructure has extremely long capital lifetimes. Most of the stuff, any power plant we're building today is probably going to be online in 2050. So in a very real way, we are already creating at this very moment the world of 2050. And so the idea that, well, let's think about this and study it for another 10 years and then maybe get started is utterly fallacious, because we're building this infrastructure, and unless we want to take a huge write-off to our economy and terminate all sorts of capital investments before their useful lives have been achieved, that's a very high cost path. We really need to get started now. I mentioned energy. Agriculture is also, I think, similarly slated for a large transformation as part of this equation. So that gives us some pretty big challenges to society. Okay, we need to change our energy behavior, we need to change our food behavior, and we need to change our agricultural behavior. And those are sectors of society that are very resistant to change. What are our options? And what have people been talking about? And we'll just power through them. People have talked about trying to do this in a voluntary way, but we've tried that now for a couple decades. It doesn't really work. We might raise a tax. But just passing a cost along to people might not necessarily lead to lower emissions. We might try command and control. That's a solution that's been put out there. The problem is no one's smart enough to figure out how to do it. No one's smart enough to figure out how to go out to every one of these facilities and dial them in the correct direction by the correct amount. And of course, in a command and control system, there's no guarantee that what somebody in some control center thinks is actually the lowest cost solution. So that basically leaves us with cap and trade. People like to talk about the why cap and trade is an inelegant or awkward way of doing things. It's sort of like democracy. It's probably true of that too until you compare all the alternatives. Energy policy is clearly a part of this. We've always had an energy policy. These are going back to the Nixon administration, the various policy reports people have put out. We have to be concerned about supply. We have to be concerned about efficiency. We have to be concerned about markets because we don't do command and control in the energy sector anymore. We rely on market forces, so the markets have to work. We have to make energy choices with a clear eye on their environmental consequences. And when we hit a bump on any of those first four, we need research and development to help us get around the intractable policy problems. Congress affects energy policy in a variety of ways. We do big energy bills that are called that. We do annual appropriations bills, which set important energy policy. We do things like the Farm Bill, which helps set energy policy. And then, of course, we're always tinkering with the tax code, and that's a huge source of energy policy. So to get our arms around this sort of energy climate continuum, I think one of the things we need to remember is that we're actually trying to influence a whole host of legislative activities, not just waiting for one big bill to come along and to try to do it that way. Sometimes big energy bills help. In 2007, we passed a rather comprehensive energy bill that for the first time in 30 years raised CAFE standards. And in the energy models, it made a difference. You know, it's going to lower our import by 2030, and more importantly, for the first time, you have some measurable effect, actually, of an enacted bill on carbon dioxide emissions. Now, that's nowhere near enough, but as Senator Warner said, you take a piece of it at a time, and then you come back and take the next chunk, and you take the next chunk after that, and that's what we're about. The next chunk that we did at the beginning of this year was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the so-called stimulus bill. It had a tremendous amount of direct spending aimed at green technology and new tax incentives, and energy and clean energy and reduced emissions were a major focus for that. We are working on, and the Energy Committee yesterday reported out a bill that's called the American Clean Energy Leadership Act. This is a 500-page bill that will be rolled somewhere into the legislative process later this year. Again, its major focus is on deployment at scale of clean energy technology, taking the next step forward on energy efficiency, because that's very important, working very hard on making our energy innovation system work better and making sure that we have the workforce for a future energy innovation system, improving energy market transparency. We still have a long transition from where we are to where we need to be, so there is some continued attention to make sure particularly that we have natural gas supplies going forward, and to focus on the whole nexus of issues between energy use and water use, because energy is the second largest use of water after irrigation in the United States, and water is a limiting factor for a lot of clean energy technologies. Getting to the first climate bill is tough, and I think I salute Senator Warner and Senator Lieberman for their efforts. I think it's hard to think of anything that Congress has done that has been truly path-breaking that made it on the first try. But the first timer out is utterly important because it gets people to focus on the issue in a way that they won't by just sending them a report. It forces them to become educated and to talk to their constituents, and it really gets the system primed so that on the next iteration you can have much more success. And I doubt that the House would have been able to pass the Waxman-Markey bill had we not had the Warner-Lieberman bill. Climate policy is obviously intimately related to energy policy. It's tougher, the politics, I think, than even energy policy is. And it's hard. Like I said, the public has not fully absorbed either the scale of the crisis or the scale of the solution. Lots of media stories, but they're kind of scattershot. We do have a sort of Tobacco Institute effect going on out there. Some industries want to play up any scientific dispute that can be found as a way of kind of pushing off the day of reckoning. And, you know, the last administration, you know, I don't think completely leveled with the public about, you know, what was going on in terms of the crisis. And the public is also has a real problem of figuring out the scale of the solution. We've never implemented a cap-and-trade system on this scale before. We've done it with sulfur dioxide. The European trading system is basically in one sector of their economy. It is not economy-wide. So that's going to be a difficulty that we're going to have to face. We're talking about tracking, creating, and trading values of assets that will be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. I think that's a very substantial public policy challenge. You know, the overall effect of this on the economy, actually you can't see it on a chart because the overall macroeconomy is so large. But individual sectors get hit very hard. And the problem, of course, is that in Washington there is no organized interest group that represent jobs that have not yet been created. Those people don't have those jobs, and so they have nobody to send to Washington to lobby on their behalf. Okay, but there are a lot of people in town making a lot of money, lobbying for the people who actually currently have jobs in industries that will have to undergo a transformation. And I think that makes the politics of climate change hard. But we need to make a start. States have done a lot. California's done a lot. The western states, the states in the northeastern United States through RGGI, they have really blazed a trail that, again, I think has helped and can help us use them as exemplars and also to learn from things that work and things that don't work. The current administration has a number of initiatives accelerating clean energy deployment, looking at letting states regulate carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act, focusing on clean energy development with foreign countries, and setting the stage for us to take up additional energy and climate legislation this summer. Whoops. Oh, dear. I obviously hit the wrong button. All right. Okay, hold a second. Okay. All right. And here are the domestic imperatives. I mean, obviously, this administration needs to figure out how to harness the leadership role of the White House. We need to figure out how to coordinate all the respective federal agencies that have an important role to play in this, and how to get them coordinated in Congress and get Congress to coordinate with itself. We will have to find an effective balance between federal action and state action. Both federal governments and state governments have important roles to play, and we need to find the right balance between those roles. We will need to find out, we will need to quantify and answer people's questions and fears about adverse economic effects and be able to talk about that in a sensible way. And we need to put together a system that's going to be adaptive, because this is not a kind of a one-shot deal. We will be able to pass probably a deeply flawed climate change bill in this Congress, and we're going to need to come back and try it again and again and again, just as Senator Warner said. And so we need to have, even if we had the perfect program to put in place, it would have to be adaptive. So we need to recognize that reality. And here are the international imperatives. The U.S. has a tremendous potential for leveraging leadership around the world. We need to find and figure out how to harness that leadership. We obviously need to emphasize and address the differences between rich countries and poor countries in dealing with this problem. And we need to somehow maintain an adequate focus on international action on this at a time of sort of unprecedented sort of global economic distress. So those are the challenges, and I think those are the forces I think drive some of the fundamental politics as I see it. And with that, I'll finish, and we'll let the next person talk.
Great. Thank you, Bob. You can begin to see just how complex the policy environment of our issue is, and the tremendous constellation of key actors and stakeholders that are going to be involved, and the difficulty of trying to sort our way through. But I think we all can learn a lesson from Senator Warner that you just have to do something. You just have to keep pushing and have to keep doing and hope for the best. Next, we're going to ask Sharon Burke to come and talk to us a little bit about the national security implications and major actors, stakeholders, and issues. And you can do it sitting, Sharon, or you can come up here, whichever you want to do.
Sitting is fine. Thank you very much, and I thank all of our hosts, the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Howard Baker Center and the Sandia National Laboratories. It's exactly the kind of collaboration we need to see going forward. So, and Senator Warner, thank you very much for your remarks. As always, you dignify any enterprise you take part in, and if it was intimidating for you, Bob, to speak in front of him, for me it's very intimidating because you have one of the nation's most important national security leaders sitting right there. And it's a little bit of hubris to talk about what the national security issues are with him sitting there, but I'll do my best. I'm going to just talk briefly about the national security implications, the geostrategic, strategic, and operational tactical implications, and then tell you why, as important as all those things are, why they're not the most important thing you need to focus on, but rather the real power in the national security community is the Department of Defense itself, as a consumer of energy and also as a validator on these concerns. So just a quick overview. Geostrategically, I think the national security community has, until very recently, really made a strong distinction between energy security and climate change, and has not seen them as coherent linked issues, and has preferred to look at energy security as a national security concern. So it's pretty obvious, right? 2/3 of the world's reserves, oil reserves, are in the Middle East. Lots of hostile countries, lots of unstable countries. Other major suppliers, of course, are Russia, Venezuela. If you're in the national security community, it's pretty easy to see why that's a problem. That the geostrategic concerns of oil supply on that level are a problem. Also, the physical vulnerability in the system, in the infrastructure, from the wellhead in Saudi Arabia, which was subject to attack by al-Qaeda a few years ago, to our own electric grid, which was subject to attack by some tree limbs in Ohio not so long ago. That the system is very vulnerable in a variety of ways, and that these are, geostrategic concerns that the department has been focused on for a long time. Now, more recently, and in no small part due to legislation that Senator Warner is responsible for, the department has started to view climate change as a geostrategic national security concern as well, as he put it, as a question about their roles and missions. So as climate change unfolds, there will be military missions involved in disaster relief and humanitarian relief, in the moving of populations, that these things will engage, and the department is increasingly looking at that. On a strategic level, the Department of Defense, the U.S. military, and associated national security elements have been defending the free flow of oil for a very long time. The flow of oil to global markets is an important global good. We have had forces forward deployed in the Persian Gulf for a very long time, including based there. We have fought more than one battle there and are in the middle of one now. And as has been made clear to me, we didn't go to war in Iraq over oil, but it's certainly part of the reason that one would want to be in Iraq in the first place. It's of strategic significance because of its part in global oil trade. This has been part of the Department of Defense's mission, and people who have served what they've served for a very long time. So this is a strategic concern for the department. And again, climate change increasingly is being seen that way too, but that's very new. Now, in an operational and tactical sense, consider that right now, I think about 70% of the supplies that are being moved into Iraq are fuel. It takes an enormous amount of fuel to run a modern military. Those supply convoys in this kind of war, a counterinsurgency war, are in what we call the battle space. So, it used to be in World War II that your supply convoys were behind your own lines. They were still a major target for attack, always have been, going back to Sparta and Athens. But now it's harder for us to defend those supply convoys because they're being picked at by improvised explosive devices, by ambushes, and we're having to put a lot of combat power to protect those supply convoys. So it's become a very important tactical issue for the U.S. military, the fact that they use so much energy. And then a separate issue is that, of course, when oil prices shot up so high, it became very expensive to be consuming all of that oil. The estimates are that last year, 2008, the Department of Defense spent $20 billion on fuel alone. So that's a lot of money, and even for a department that has as much money as the department does, it's going to squeeze out other things. One of those other things that's very important to the department is operations and maintenance spending. This war is wearing out equipment much faster than anyone anticipated, and the cost of replacing and repairing that equipment is very high. If you're spending all your money on fuel, then that's usually where the money's going to get taken out of. So these are driving concerns for the Department of Defense as far as what are the national security implications. Now, where is the real power of the Department of Defense? It's as a consumer. And this is a very untapped power, I believe. First of all, when you total up the Department of Defense budget, and Senator Warner can nod or shake his head if I'm in the ballpark, if you add in things like veterans care, which are separately accounted for, but are rightly should be considered part of the entire national security expense, you're talking about almost $1 trillion a year. Just the on-budget expense is more than $500 billion a year. This is a lot of money. $20 billion of it last year went to fuel. It's almost hard to imagine the scale of this. There are more than 500,000 facilities in this country under the control of the Department of Defense. I think it's something like 30 million acres worldwide that they control. They used probably more than, I think the estimate I saw was 1,000 trillion BTUs of energy last year. This is the single largest consumer of energy in the world. Now, that's only accounts for about 1.5% of total U.S. fuels consumption when you're talking about liquid fuels. But consider what that means. I saw in the Energy Bulletin, they said that means that the Department of Defense alone consumes as much oil as the country of Nigeria, which is 140 million people. This is an extremely significant consumer of energy in the world, not just this country. And that gives it tremendous innovation push and pull as a consumer, demand pull. It hasn't been used yet for a variety of reasons, I think. Now, what are the opportunities for changing that? What are the reasons for changing that? As the Senator mentioned, the 2008 defense authorization required the Department of Defense to consider climate change a national security issue, essentially. It said, you will consider this in all of your strategy and planning. So the Quadrennial Defense Review, which is a very big deal for the department, if it works right, all of the planning and procurement that the department does should lash up with what the Quadrennial Defense Review says the country's strategy is. The Quadrennial Defense Review, which is in the middle of drafting right now, is looking at climate change as a national security issue and tying explicitly energy use and climate change together. I would say that the department, we have no idea what its carbon footprint is. No idea. It's never been calculated, and I'm not even sure we really know how to calculate it. Some of the services claim that they know how to calculate their own footprint, but I think that's, I would like to see the inputs to those calculations before I would believe it. And there are other elements, PA&E, plans analysis and evaluation is an element in the Department of Defense that has supposedly calculated the real cost of fuel for the department, because keep in mind that it's not just, if you're paying, I think the estimate I've seen is if you're paying $2 at the pump, they're paying anywhere from, they're paying as much as $45 a gallon at the pump because of the refining costs, of the cost of moving the fuel. Again, if you have to move supply convoys through the desert in Iraq with a lot of force protection, it's very expensive. So for the first time, the QDR needs to look at all of those things as geostrategic and strategic concerns and plan for how the department is going to deal with it. Of course, a part of that has to be how the department itself is going to deal with its fuel use. And there are two really important opportunities there. First, in this, what I call the fully burdened cost of fuel. How much is the fuel really costing them? That's going to be, the real economics of fuel for the Department of Defense is going to help drive change once they really know that. But also, I think in the last panel they talked about wicked problems and how, it's hard to get your hands around it. The Department of Defense doesn't do wicked problems. I mean, everything's a wicked problem for the national security community. How do you know who your threat is going to be in 30 years? You don't. But you do your best estimate and you procure billions of dollars against it today. So for the Department of Defense, if energy use and climate change are national security challenges and we have uncertainties and unknowables and scale problems, they can deal with that. So, for example, right now, if they are allowed to procure the F-22 or the F-35 or air refueling tankers, those platforms are going to be in use till 2030. Well, you told us 2030 things really start to get bad, but they're going to buy those things today. So they're going to have to design it today to deal with that world. This is the way the Department of Defense can help transform our society. And the Department of Defense reacts to presidential directives and secretarial directives. This can be done. So it's not a wicked problem, it's a problem to be solved. I have a military imperative. I need to protect my forces. I don't want to move fuel across the desert and have people killed. I don't want to put all of my money into paying for fuels and not into the other things that I need. And I need systems that are and installations that are going to be viable for 10, 20, 30, and even 40 years. So this is a problem the Department of Defense can deal with. And in the process of figuring out how they can meet their needs, that can provide a larger benefit for the country because they can drive innovation. It doesn't work if you come to the Department of Defense and you say, solve my social problem. But it does work if you say, I have a mission at the Department of Defense that I need to figure out how to do better and do in a way that won't cost lives and that will allow us to meet the threats in the future. They can do that. So the question is, we need to find the technological solutions, appropriately account for the full costs, and then change the business processes, which is no small thing, because the acquisition system will need to consider energy as an important good and a key performance parameter in building systems. And then you need to get some cultural change in place. Where that has to come more than anything else is on considering climate change as a national security issue. And again, we've had legislative change in that regard that's made a huge difference. And we have, of course, a leadership change that also makes a huge difference. And then the last thing to consider, so the Department of Defense, we've got all these security implications. We've got the power of the department as a consumer, and it has never weighed in that way in the policy debates, and probably will not be comfortable doing so, but is comfortable solving its own problems. But then there's the other place where the Department of Defense and the national security community can really come to play, and that's as a validator. If you look at the Gallup poll does an annual look at most trusted institutions in the country, and the number one most trusted institution in the country since 1988 is the U.S. military. I think Congress is last. Sorry about that, Bob. Like 13%, I think, of the. But the military, the public trusts the military, and if you have what Senator Warner described, you have retired generals and admirals coming out and saying these are national security problems. And I think, Bob, you said we're not all going to make money, but we're all going to pay. And we can pay now or pay a lot more later. This is what we need to do, and this is how we need to defend our country. It's going to make a difference in that larger cultural and public change that you all talked about in the last panel. So the national security community is a very important player in this debate in a way that I think it should be encouraging, because they're going to have to deal with these problems one way or another. They do now. They will for years and years to come. They have great power as a consumer, great power as a validator, and this is something that's doable because that's the way that community works. So it is a command and control society. That's the whole point. So it's just the only question is making sure it's done right, and I have great faith that this administration and this Congress are prepared to do that. So that's national security community, and I'm delighted to turn it over to Labor. And although I think, Arnie, you want to introduce the next speaker, correct?
Well, first let's thank you, Sharon. And we will Bracken come on up and tell us the jobs and employment implications of all of this.
Great. I'm Bracken Hendricks. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and I'm really thrilled to be here. And I also just want to say thank you for your leadership, Senator Warner, and everything you've done for the country. It's your leadership on this issue was truly an act of courage and vision, and I think we're all in your debt. So I'm very pleased to be here with you. And in this group, I found this a very, very exciting conversation to join into, to have a conversation about systems. Because to really solve this problem, we actually do need to step back, and we need to ask ourselves, what problem are we trying to solve? And I think that's a very, very important thing to put at the forefront of the question, because there's an immense environmental, technical, social, economic problem, but it's functioning at so many levels, and specifically from a systems perspective. This is a question of markets. It's a question of geopolitical instability. It's a question of ecological systems, and ultimately of cultural systems. The communications challenge that Senator Warner was speaking of at the beginning is profoundly important. We're asking people to take risks and to make fundamental investments in things that have yet to be built. And that's a huge challenge. It's a very different sort of a challenge from what we're used to. And I think this conversation about systems pulls us back to a much more powerful place to take action. Because we need to design a solution that is at the scale and the speed and the scope worthy of the problem that we're trying to solve. In Bob Simon's presentation, he talked about the change of sea level and what that will do to Bangladesh. One solution, if you're India, is to build a fence. That's a design solution. I think it's a wholly inadequate solution to the sort of problem that we're looking at, but it actually, I think, is quite revealing. So this gets us to the question of jobs, and why are we talking about jobs? I started in this work as an urban planner, and I started with very, very local issues, and I was really intrigued by place. Because in a community, if you're a mayor, you have to do stuff, and it's going to create jobs, it'll deal with the local environment, and all of these things in place become very closely related. As we get into larger and larger systems, it's harder to see the response of these feedbacks. I think that's also a very important piece. But let me just run through this. This is a critically important graph. We're all, intimately familiar with it. This is the hockey stick, the change in global atmospheric CO2. And if you understand the system of climate interactions, this is a terrifying slide. But this is a graph about atmospheric chemistry. So at a moment when we're in a state of profound economic insecurity, it is very, very difficult, as sobering as this is. We're talking about trying to get to 450 parts per million just to stabilize at a 50-50 chance of avoiding hundreds of millions of climate refugees and billions of people going without reliable access to drinking water. This is just to get to a 50-50 chance. This is, we have to do these sorts of reductions, but this is atmospheric chemistry. This is essentially the slide that Bob Simon showed earlier. And, an area 6 times the size of the state of California melts in 1 year. It's never happened before. If you understand ocean currents and how we cool the climate and how you get local agriculture to survive based on agricultural soil, moisture content in the soil, what this means in terms of famine and migration is terrifying. But we're talking about ice. And General Motors just went into bankruptcy. And we have people who are in danger of losing the roof over their head, and it's a very, very difficult thing to organize people around ice when they're worried about a pink slip or a foreclosure. Maybe we can bring it down to, these are signal species, right? These are the species that are starting to actually starve. I mean, that means it's starting to happen now in real terms with real species in real places. There is direct impact on ecological systems. But again, as much as I care about polar bears, if I'm trying to pay my mortgage and put food on the table for my kids, I would make the decision to trade off the environment for jobs. And I understand these issues. This is one, there's one last picture that I often show that I didn't put in here, but it is a house in Shishmaref, Alaska. It's very similar to the one that Bob showed. And I actually wrote a book on this with Congressman Inslee from Washington State. And we wrote an entire book. And after we'd written this book about climate change, I needed a photograph of Shishmaref, Alaska, where the houses are tumbling into the ocean. And I called this tribal leader, Lucy Ningawak, who is actually moving the town of Shishmaref, Alaska, inland several miles because the barrier ice is melting and the storms are coming in more fiercely. The permafrost is melting. Houses are tumbling into the sea. And I asked her for a photograph, and she said, hold on, I'll send my husband out with a digital camera. I'll take a picture, email it to you. You'll have it in 10 minutes. And it was only at that moment, after writing an entire book, that I realized when we talk about global warming, we're talking about people's homes, their neighbors, and their communities. And it's only by bringing it down to that level, putting a human face on it, that we will start to build the political will to create the solutions. But I think there's an even deeper change that we need to make than the human face on the problem, which is profound. 300 to 400 million climate refugees with a 3-degree warming. That's huge. 2 to 4 billion people without reliable access to drinking water on a daily basis. A profound human face on that problem. But this is probably the most important thing to understand. And from a systems perspective, this is quite a sobering fact. It's really worth just really thinking about deeply. Usually, in almost every problem that we face, inaction, the status quo, is an option. If you kind of continue doing nothing, you can proceed and you'll stay basically in a steady state. the climate crisis means that inaction leads you to catastrophic global warming. That's the default option, is we proceed down that path. This is, Bob's image about how we need to fundamentally change the makeup of our energy system. Without changing, that's what we get. The interesting thing, and this is why then we get into solutions, is that just as we're looking at feedbacks, very complicated feedbacks, a warming leads to less soil moisture, leads to less agricultural productivity, leads to famine, leads to migration, leads to warfare, those feedback loops in that system, there's an equally interesting set of positive feedback loops as you build a green economy. And this is the thing that's very hard to understand as well, is the profound opportunity of building this green economy. These investments mean less waste, less consumer spending. It means less urban heat island effect, less heat stroke, less death. And it also means skills, and it means investments in competitiveness and new market exports, new industries, and a leading edge approach in the domestic economy, as well as healthier and more livable communities at the local level. So we need to be thinking about these feedbacks at the system level, not only on the problem side, but at building these solutions. So this is the Princeton wedges, Sokoloff and Pacala. Most of you are obviously very familiar with this. How do you get 7 billion ton reductions in atmospheric CO2? It means 1 billion tons a year in about 50 years. Well, they asked a very useful and important question, and this is a design question. Okay, 1 billion tons of atmospheric CO2 means nothing to me. What does it mean in terms of real stuff? And it turns out it's a 700% increase in installations of solar panels, a 50% increase in installation of wind, a 25% cut in energy use in all buildings and all appliances, and a 50% cut in vehicle miles traveled for 2 billion cars worldwide at a time when vehicle miles traveled are only rising year after year. So there's a whole lot of stuff to build, bricks and mortar, steel, concrete, and this becomes a political opportunity. If we can identify the things we need to build and talk about them and talk to the people, as Bob said, there is no lobby for future jobs, but it turns out that we've got a $2.2 trillion unmet infrastructure need in this economy, according to the American Society for Civil Engineers. That's transit projects, roads and bridges. It's things that aren't getting built today. The Recovery Act went a long way to it, but I mean, look at this, $2.2 trillion, $775 billion, a huge amount of money, and it only begins to scratch the surface. It was only about $80 billion went into infrastructure. At the Center for American Progress, we did a study with the University of Massachusetts, and we looked at, this was when $100 billion seemed like a lot of money, and it was less than a year ago. But we said, what if you did a stimulus package and you put it into efficiency and renewables, and then we compared that traditional stimulus and we compared it to oil. And it turns out that with the traditional stimulus, 22 cents on the dollar goes out of the economy on imported goods, just a standard basket of goods. If you invest in efficiency and renewables, only 9 cents leaves, and that's because you're buying infrastructure, you're paying for skills of workers, and you're sinking it into the built environment. This is good stimulus. We also found if you spend it on oil, if you spend it on green stuff relative to oil, you get 4 times the number of jobs and 3 times the number of jobs at decent wages. So this is pretty interesting. Then we dug down, what are those jobs? Who does the work of building this green economy? And it's not, Jetsons, folks in jetpacks installing solar panels. This is not niche, futuristic green jobs. These are very familiar jobs for carpenters and insulators and railroad conductors and electricians and mechanical engineers. It's basically taking the existing economy and retooling it for another objective. This is why systems thinking is important. We have all these systems for skilling workers, for economic development, for investing in moving goods and material. We just need to optimize for a different set of goals that involve reducing carbon and investing back in productive and clean industries. And there's a huge opportunity here. Interestingly, we usually talk about industry and we talk about cars when we talk about global warming. Much of the consumption of energy takes place in buildings, 43% of our energy. That's an interesting fact. If you look at the new buildings that will be built and the major retrofits that will be built, that's really important for green building standards, and all the LEED certified stuff is great. but it's only going to touch about half of the buildings in 2030. So if we want a 25% reduction in all buildings everywhere in their energy use, we got to dig deep, and that actually is exciting again from a jobs perspective. It means going house to house, neighborhood to neighborhood, figuring out the economic systems, the financing tools to actually make those investments in energy efficiency, and you can have a very interesting conversation about jobs. Again, just to dig a little more deeply into a slide similar to one Bob showed, this is the McKinsey cost curve. Probably, again, many of you are familiar with it, but I want to use it to tell just a specific story. They did a very elegant analytic exercise, which is they took all of the investments in global warming solutions, carbon emission reductions, and they arrayed them from the lowest cost to the highest cost. And that middle line there is the break-even point. So anything above the line, you're spending a little bit more to get the reduction than you actually get back in terms of financial return. The stuff below the line, you're actually earning more than you gain. They call this a negative cost abatement strategy. Now, in the business world, they have another word for this term, and it's called a profit. So we have positive returns on investment that we're leaving on the table right now because we have broken markets that are externalizing costs and the feedbacks are all wrong. So we need to fix a system, a large, complex system. We need to change market signals faced by real estate owners. But this is not a cost. These are actually profitable investments that would help society overall, not only in an environmental context, but from an economic context as well, and they're getting left on the sidelines. Again, efficiency. This is just looking at the changing price of various types of energy, and you probably can't see it, but at the very bottom there's a small red line, and it represents energy efficiency. The cheapest, cleanest source of energy is the energy you never have to burn. Again, when you come at it from a systems perspective, this is a design problem as much as an economic or a technical problem. So you design around actually not having to do stuff and getting the same benefit. You still have cold beer and hot showers, and you get all the services you need, but you do it with less stuff, less waste, less pollution. And this is just an interesting point to underscore at this time of tight credit markets and the economic downturn. This is just a chart showing risk to return. Low risk is commonly associated with low return. High risk, high return. A treasury bill versus a venture capital fund. Energy efficiency has a very interesting property because it's a very predictable high rate of return with a fairly low risk because you're actually you're making predictable investments that yield a very understandable return. But again, we have structural barriers to getting there. So we've made all these fundamental investments with the Recovery Act, but we have systems that are broken in the larger structure of incentives and so forth. So if we start looking at a cap and trade bill, if we start looking at regulatory policies like a renewable energy standard that require a high percentage of renewable energy as an opportunity to rechannel money into positive investment flows, you have a very different conversation you can have. A very different conversation you can have with a sheet metal worker or a utility worker or a consumer in their home if you're talking about realizing new opportunities. And then this just is a quick diagram showing the various skills. When we talk about building the stuff of a clean energy economy, we're talking about investing in blue-collar jobs and career ladders, areas of the economy that we haven't really focused on in a very long time. But the jobs of building a green economy, of retrofitting homes, of good manufacturing jobs, they tend to have fairly low barriers to entry in terms of skills, opportunities to acquire skills in the workplace, and relatively good wages and benefits to support families. So if you're looking for economic stimulus, if you're looking to invest somewhere in the economy, rebuilding this base of decent jobs that you can do with your hands are actually a very, very good place to focus. So we're getting the carbon emission reductions, we're rebuilding communities to achieve the environmental benefits, the safety and security benefits, and we can do it in a way that actually creates dignified and ennobling work. Just a couple very, very quick slides. I just want to talk a little bit about the equity impacts, because I liked what Sharon said about don't go to the Department of Defense and ask them to help you solve your social problems, but tell them why this is a social issue, why this is a security issue, and why it meets their mission. I do just want to say that from an economic equity perspective, housing, transportation, and utilities account for over half of the average working family's budget in the United States. If we can do something to cut people's costs for housing and transportation and energy payments, which we can by advancing climate solutions, we can actually have a profound impact on equity, and we can really do some good work in people's lives. But we need to be smart about it, because it won't happen unless we design systems around that. Again, transit options. If you just simply make it easier for someone to live with only one car instead of two, it saves $6,000 on an average working family's household budget. That's a real impact. And we need to think about this as an opportunity to touch people's lives in profound and positive ways at a time of great economic distress. But we need to be designing solutions with an end toward who the user is and what problems we're trying to solve as we present these solutions. So it's very, very important to understand all of the dimensions of the global climate crisis. It's critically, critically important. But understanding how to build those solutions is an equally important but very different task, and we need to get good at talking about that. And you in your work with systems and analysis really think about how to design systems that will help present the benefits of solutions, and I think we'll actually see a changed politics. I understand that an earlier speaker was talking a little bit about this as a civil rights movement. My book is called Apollo's Fire. We talk about John F. Kennedy and the role of leadership and vision, but maybe the Marshall Plan is a better example. We're talking about rebuilding everything in a very fundamental way, the fabric of society, to create new and as yet unimagined opportunities. And as we look at changing the politics, which is really the real barrier, it's not economic or scientific, it's about political will, the civil rights movement probably is a very good example. And I was down in Memphis recently for the 40th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination with a civil rights group that was organizing around green issues, which I found really exciting to see people say, I want a piece of the green economy as a positive thing. And I ran across a quote by Martin Luther King, which is it's a little touchy-feely, so forgive me for this, but I think it's a good one, and it underscores this. Martin Luther King said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hatred cannot drive out hatred. Only love can do that." And I think it's a really important thing to come back to, because understanding a problem is critically important, but you can't just negate it with its opposite. You have to understand what you want to build. We want a green economy that puts people to work, that pulls us out of a recession, and that solves global warming while making us all safer and secure and living more prosperous lives. And so we're really talking about making the environment a lens for looking at the outcomes of our economic activity so that we create more prosperity, more wealth, more security, and more happiness. And that's really what we're trying to do ultimately. And by focusing on these solutions, we actually get to a very different set of opportunities and a very different politics. And it's actually one very deeply rooted in the American tradition of rolling up our sleeves, rising in the face of adversity, and getting on with business. It's what we as Americans do well, and this is a huge opportunity if we focus on it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bracken. Bracken, thank you very much. Our final presenter is Tony Janetos, who's going to talk to us in a lot more detail, drill deeper in the environmental and natural resources issues surrounding this complex set of problems.
All right, thank you very much. When I was invited to speak here, I asked a bunch of questions. Well, what do you really want me to cover? And what I decided to try to do was talk a little bit about stakeholders on both sides of this issue. And by both sides of this issue, I mean the stakeholders who worry about how to mitigate or reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, and those people who worry about the consequences. I'm going to try to touch both sides of this issue. There are clearly many stakeholders involved in climate and energy policy, consumers, providers, whoever suffers the consequences of climate change. And I'm going to talk a lot about that at the end of this talk, and a wide variety of policymakers, both public and private. It's important to treat both. Each has a unique perspective and expectations of an overall process, but each also should have an expectation of having sufficiently robust information available to them so that they're comfortable in making decisions. So what I want you to, just as an example, I want you to think about, as we've been thinking all day, about the issues associated with first climate policy. What level of greenhouse gases do we want to end up with? What is the climate that we want to end up with? How do we adapt to those changes that we cannot avoid because they will occur? Energy policy, what is the energy mix that allows us to meet that target or those targets? And how these interact with natural resources. And in particular, I want to talk a little bit about land use and agriculture. those things that affect how we actually use the land and how they interact with climate and energy policy. What effects on land resources might biofuels have as a result of these actions? I'll use this as a particular example, both for illustrating the importance of involving different stakeholders in these discussions, but also to harken back to some of the discussions we had earlier this morning and this afternoon, to think hard about systems. Because an analysis of systems is only as good as those interactions that you allow to occur within your model. If you leave those interactions out, you will get an answer that is not only not instructive, but is dangerously incorrect. So we've done such a study. We actually published the results of this in Science about 2.5 weeks ago, where we've started to look at what are the land use implications of stabilizing atmospheric CO2 concentrations at 450 parts per million, so about 50 or 60 parts per million more than they are today. And this example shows what happens in a world where you're stabilizing carbon at this level, but you're not putting an economic value on carbon on the landscape. You might think of this, in fact, as the policy world that we currently inhabit. Deforestation doesn't count in terms of carbon. What happens in this particular world when you go towards an aggressive, what turns out, I think, in fact, to be a fairly aggressive stabilization target, the demand for bioenergy, for purpose-grown bioenergy, becomes so large, mostly in the second half of the century, that it crowds out forests, unmanaged forests. It forces croplands to go into less productive land, and so, in fact, more forest land and unmanaged ecosystems are transformed to cropland. And this is in striking contrast to what happens with the same policy target, 450 parts per million CO2 at the end of the century, when you value all the carbon, when you value terrestrial carbon the same way you value fossil carbon. And what happens in this case is that purpose-grown bioenergy still exists, and in fact there's a lot of bioenergy in the energy system, but most of it is from agricultural residue, municipal waste. And in fact, you get what in this case, in this system, is a very sensible result. If carbon is worth something, it's worth something, and if you value it all, you get more of it. And you get more of it on the landscape if you value that carbon on the landscape, and if you leave it without value, you lose it. One of the reasons that this is a really important, we think, and many people have thought this is a really important result, is that this is the world that Kyoto left us with. Through a very well-meaning and well-intentioned intent on the part of many organizations around the world to take tropical forests off the table because it was felt to be too complex, too difficult, too hard an issue to figure out how to include them in a global trading mechanism. But instead, what happens is people, because they did not have an appropriate system for analysis, by attempting to take forests off the table, instead they've put them in play. This is a tremendous challenge. Failure to value this carbon could have, in fact, disastrous consequences for many systems that we care very much about. For forests, for other unmanaged ecosystems. It would essentially not allow us to use agriculture and forestry waste streams as an important bioenergy feedstock. And then, in fact, if you value this carbon in an appropriately designed system, a larger stock of forests and unmanaged ecosystems is desirable, and that provides a service whose value, and in this case, a direct economic value, increases throughout the century. And that, in fact, improving crop yields, which we will have to do to feed a world of 9 billion people, 50% more people than exist on the earth today, is itself a carbon mitigation, a carbon management, a greenhouse gas mitigation strategy that is twice as large as any of those 1 billion tons of carbon per year wedges. Previously, it says it's as important as any energy supply technology. So, we turn from models to the real world. What are we actually doing to forests? These are data that we put together for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. This shows what the actual change from a combination of satellite data and country-level forest data for the last 20 years of the 20th century. The areas in red are the areas of the most rapid change, in this case decrease, in forest area. And so what are we doing to forests, in fact, is that we're cutting them down. And so that the biggest change in this landscape that has consequences both for the maintenance of biological diversity, the regulation of water quality and water flow, and ultimately sequestering carbon on the landscape of this planet in fact, the cheapest way we know how, which is allowing trees to grow, we are putting at risk. We continue to lose right now about 1% per year of tropical forest, and globally that rate has hardly budged for about the last 30 years. So this is, in fact, one of these wicked problems. We know this is important. We know this is an important component of an overall approach to carbon management and climate change. We know that losing these ecosystems has other consequences about which people care a great deal. And we found it difficult, nationally, globally, regionally, to construct the policy framework to reduce and to ultimately halt or even reverse these trends. Now, the other part of this challenge with respect to stakeholders is who suffers the consequences of climate change. Somebody said earlier today, I don't remember who it was, that it's difficult to think about climate change in the sense of something that will happen 50 years from now. Its consequences aren't really strongly felt. Consequences that are felt are happening far away. This is not correct. This is simply factually incorrect. This is the report that was referred to that was released the day before yesterday. This is the brochure. I was privileged to be part of the author team of this report. And one of the bottom lines of this report is that this is not an issue for 50 years from now or 100 years from now, something our grandchildren and their children will wrestle with. We have consequences from a changing physical climate system in this country on our natural resources in our backyards right now. No equivocation about it. We have changes that are going on right now. If we do nothing about the emissions of greenhouse gases, they will get worse. If we succeed in crafting an aggressive policy, both domestically and internationally, they won't become as bad, but we will still have to cope with some of them and adapt to them. So within this report, we go through how has climate already changed, focused on the U.S. and putting that in a global context. How is it likely to change in the future under different assumptions, a business as usual assumption or lower emission scenarios? How is this change that we've already seen affecting us now for natural resources, for water, for agriculture, for health, for the transportation infrastructure, and so forth? How is it likely to affect us in the future? And of course, what you can't see down at the bottom, it says, what are our options for responding? And what consequences might they have? So, you didn't get to see the graph. This is the graph. This is actually from one of the component studies that we summarized in this. This is the baseline, and what you can't read on this is these red areas are the parts of the transportation in the transportation system in the Gulf that are 4 feet above mean sea level rise or less. And so this is the present day baseline. If you were to get that 4 feet of sea level rise, here's what happens. This area in the Gulf is simply lost. This is now open water. Unless somebody were to spend a few $1 trillion and build a seawall, which seems unlikely from an engineering perspective, and would be a tremendously expensive solution to this particular problem. What are the implications for process? The stakeholders for both sides of this climate dilemma are incredibly varied, and they are differently configured amongst those who largely care about consequences and those who care about energy and climate. The decision-making communities for these two aspects of climate change consequences in the energy side are largely separate, communicate rarely, and generally poorly. We have a need, I think, for a new national dialogue, both to understand what is happening now, what is actually happening in our backyards, what are the prospects for the future, and how should people think about this problem? You know, what are the stakes for acting or not? What kinds of actions might end up being sensible? What is their scientific and economic foundation? And how can we actually begin that national dialogue in a constructive way rather than talking at each other? Constructing a process that inspires both trust and participation on the part of all these different stakeholder communities, whether they're national communities, the private sector, or town and municipal officials, has not yet been done successfully. But it clearly ought to have important regional components, both within the U.S. and internationally. It also needs to engage the knowledge community, those of us who use these kinds of system models or field studies as a way to explore the world and try to understand the world and how we might achieve a world that is different than the one, different and better than the one we're heading towards. But the knowledge community also needs to understand that listening to stakeholders is important to them. In the very first U.S. national assessment 10 years ago, we had a very graphic example of this. All of us who were participating in that had constructed a whole series of analyses using ecosystem models, which we were very proud of. We talked about carbon flow and carbon fluxes and carbon storage, and we took we did a big set of presentations up in the part of the country where I grew up, up in New England and New Hampshire, and talked about this, and people just kind of sat there. And they really weren't very interested in all the stuff we thought was very cool. And they said, well, what about the sugar maple? Well, what about the sugar maple? Sugar maple actually disappears in terms of where it's optimally adapted to grow, because the climate that supports sugar maples essentially moves out of the U.S. Sometime around the middle of the century. Well, most of the stakeholders that we talked to didn't care so much about carbon fluxes and carbon flows. The policy people cared about it because that's the currency that they understood. But the people where I grew up cared a lot about the sugar maple. And you laugh, but it's a sense of place. It's important. It's very important. It's not so much important in their pocketbook, some parts of the state, but it's important to establishing a sense of place and a sense of connection to where you live and whether or not it's wise to put that at risk. And if you do, what you can do about it, because people do want to do something about it. At the same time, the U.S. clearly needs to engage the international community in a way that respects the desires and the needs and the rights for the developing world to make the progress that it must make. They are rightly concerned that without a global solution, that their aspirations will never be fulfilled, and that's simply wrong. I think it's a solvable problem, but it's a problem we must acknowledge and work towards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Has your speaker arrived? Or? Okay, so we have our speaker that's coming in a few minutes has been delayed because of a flight and is on her way here. So we do. Do you guys want to stand up and stretch a little bit? You've been sitting a long time. We do have time for questions for the panel. In fact, Senator Warner, I thought if you had any final remarks you wanted to make or any questions of the panel. Okay, but we'll throw it open then to you. Thank you for being so patient throughout the day and for all of your additional great comments. So, does anybody have any questions or comments? You're tired. Yes, Robert?
Just Mr. Simon, you talked about the cap and trade. Yeah, I'm Robert Kleinberg. Just a question for Mr. Simon, who talked about the cap and trade regime and the approach that's being contemplated in Congress versus the European approach, which I gather is a much more limited single sector. Which is the politically wiser approach? I mean, it seems to me that maybe a more limited approach just to try it out might be more wise.
Well, that's a tough one because here is the problem that I think the Europeans have discovered, that they implemented a trading system based largely on their power sector, and they are controlling that, and they let sort of like everybody else off the hook. And then the question is, okay, fine, it's kind of like driving into a cul-de-sac. Okay, you got there, you set up a system that was aimed at controlling point source emissions from very large emitters. Okay, so you constructed since you started with that sector, you designed a system tailored to that sector, and then you say, what about transportation? Because what about all these other? What about agriculture? What about all these other parts of the problem that absolutely do need to be addressed? So I think that there is one set of issues is between an economy-wide system and a sector-specific system. Goes to if you start off with just one sector, you may come with a set of strategies that then aren't easily transferable to other sectors of the economy. That's point number one. Point number two, if you have a purely sector-specific strategy, and instead of an economy-wide strategy, you run into a little bit of the same problem you have generically with command and control, is that no one's really quite bright enough anywhere to quite figure out how to make the different sectors come together and match up so that you actually are getting at the lowest cost reductions across the sectors. And my observation of regulation done from Capitol Hill over the years is that when industry or society sees a regulatory system that has seams in it, where things don't quite match up, usually seams is where arbitrage happens. So people rush to the seams because they figured out, it costs you the same. Something very similar is happening here to here. It costs a whole lot more here than here. I can make a buck, which is that's how a free enterprise system works. I salute people's looking for ways to make money and innovation, but when you sort of construct a regulatory scheme for a problem this complex, the more seams you leave in, the more risks that you will have, that you will get sort of non-optimal circumstances and sort of rent seeking or you're sort of leaving money on the table or taking money away from people and not getting anything for it. So I think that is also another factor that you have to consider in sort of the overall design of it. To the extent that you can make this as much of an economy-wide system as you can, you do increase your chances of actually having the market find lowest cost reductions, which is what we want, and then avoiding these unanticipated consequences that are occurring at the seams of your system.
Do any of our other panelists want to comment? Bracken or Tony or Sharon? Okay.
That was excellent.
Any other questions for our panelists? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Margie Tatro from Sandia National Labs. I'm struck from the comments this morning. This question is going to go to Sharon Burke, but a common denominator in two stories we've heard today. Mr. Mabee talked about the people who were at the pointy end of the spear in the fisheries and the law enforcement sector were the ones that had greatest motivation for an overall systems change because they were the ones who had to implement. They saw danger on a day-to-day basis and they had to respond to that. Similarly, our military is in the face of danger every day. And I'm curious, Sharon, you implied that under perhaps the past years there was not as much action going forward from the military, that they may have not recognized their ability as a consumer and as an implementer. And just wondered if you would expand on that, because my experience is a little different. We've seen tremendous leadership in the past few years with the military recognizing that they are powerful as a consumer and as an implementer of new technology. So what do you see as the difference now and something that might be more an opportunity for the military compared to the past?
I think not seeing their power as a consumer is in part in the policy conversation, is that when energy policy is made in Washington, that the Department of Defense does not take part in that conversation. But as such a significant consumer, they could and they should. There are lots of interesting developments going on in the department, but you have to remember what a big enterprise it is, so that even if someone you're working with is doing something really interesting, like, Nellis Air Force Base, the president was just there last month. They have 140 acres of solar arrays, but that's such a small part of, and even on that base, it's only 25% of their power. So that as a system of systems, then the Department of Defense is a microcosm of our entire national system. It's not at a system level at all. What's among the things that have changed are, as I said, the cost has gotten so high for them, but also it's become a force protection issue. One of the problems is always going to be with the military is what's their job? Their job is to fight and win the nation's wars, and that doesn't change. And when you go to a commander in the field and you say, I need you to cut your energy use, he's going to say, look, I'm kind of fighting a war here. Can you come back later? But if you tell him your supply convoys are getting shot and it's because you're moving, it's because of the kind of war you're in, but you don't have to move so much fuel through space. We know there are things we can do. We can spray foam insulation on your tents and cut your fuel use in half. They're going to say, that's good. Let's do that. So it's gotten to that point, too, where they're starting to understand it. The people at the top in the military are extraordinary, and they understand it as a geostrategic and strategic concern, as a driving national defense interest. But the people who are actually the pointy end of the spear, literally, fighting in the field, also understand that it's killing their people. So it's sort of all those things coming together are driving a systemic change in the Department of Defense and how they look at these issues.
Bracken?
Just one other thought. There's a slight difference to the moment we're in now, too, in building these solutions and in understanding the role that the military can play. As we look at the task of building out an economy based on new clean energy systems, one of the very, very fundamental tasks is not about sort of basic science and R&D. It's about deployment and how you scale up and deal with some of the more expensive parts of product development and get commercialized manufacturing at scale. And there's a very, very interesting role that the military can play because they are focused on results, because they have, a very different system of procurement. They can be related to, and they're purchasing at fairly large scales. They can have relationships with manufacturers. For this particular moment, the Department of Defense can get great benefit from the sort of secure access to reliable systems that either secure the grid, that reduce the supply convoys, movement of fuels and so forth, but it can also do tremendous benefit in terms of the commercialization of these technologies. And it's not at all unlike what happened with the production of semiconductors, leading to huge commercial applications for new telecommunications equipment, the role that NASA played in a whole new generation of materials science. If we're smart about the procurement power of the Department of Defense, we can actually make ourselves much more secure as we're deploying these technologies.
And I'd just say that part of being smart about that is not using the Department of Defense to solve the nation's energy problem, but is letting the Department of Defense solve its own problem and conduct its missions better. That's where the Department of Defense's innovation is most powerful. So that's the only danger I see, is that you shouldn't use your military to solve the nation's problems, but the military has a problem it needs to solve. And there's a long history, as I think people here know better than anyone else in the country, of that innovation for a specific problem having commercial applications in the larger economy. And given that DoD is a microcosm of the larger economy, that's highly likely in this case.
Yes, Margie, one example of that, I think, is one that we talked about in San Diego, which is the military's use of maybe more plug-in hybrid types of vehicles so they can get electrical sources and recharge things without having to move a whole lot of fuel.
They've had mixed success so far. They can't get the power they need out of the drivetrain. But also, I would just say, one of the things I would like to see the department consider is that as they look at that they also consider the knock-on effects. So, for example, if it's a lithium-ion battery, about 50% of the lithium stocks in the world are in Bolivia, which is not necessarily better than relying on Saudi Arabia for your oil. So it's also an interesting question of getting the department to look across the entire range of challenges, which we're not there yet.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Let me just,
Senator.
The buck stops on my desk. I was chairman of the Senate committee for 6 years. And Thank you was very much involved, of course, in all of the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. But in fairness to the military, they're a salute and march-off organization, totally responsive to the President of the United States, who is Commander-in-Chief, and the Secretary of Defense. And there I was, sitting day after day, watching the whole thing, working on the budgets, working on everything. And it was this retired community that finally began to get my attention. And then up comes the Center for Naval Analysis, and they devoted a whole report to this subject. And then the CSIS, the Center for Strategic Studies, put out their report, and Sharon's group have started it. So the philanthropic and think tanks out here began to get a hold of the issue. And I'm not here to put President Bush on report or Rumsfeld or anybody else, but the fact of the matter is there wasn't this momentum developing within the commander-in-chief ranks to move the department out. Now, President Obama has taken some strong initiatives, and I hope he follows through with them, and that Congress has become energized. Now, I'm very proud to be a Republican. I'm going to get shoveled into the grave with the R on my gravestone. I'm not going to switch or anything like that. But I was the only single man on the Environment Committee that would vote for this thing. And when I got to the floor, again, my party was not, keen on it, because I think they were primarily worried about the economy, and we can only try so many big issues at one time, in fairness to them. So the whole wave of thinking on this issue has been building up in other areas than in the commander-in-chief ranks. And now I think it's gained a wonderful momentum because of groups like this one and the think tanks and others who really got behind this effort and got my attention. I tell you that. I'm happy to get out there. And, I didn't slip away with the tail between my legs. I came right back when I retired and pitched in, and here I am. So, and I'll keep going, and I just hope that you can do the same thing. So in fairness to the questionnaire, where was the questionnaire? Does that help somewhat in the answer to the question? I mean, the labs are always thinking decades ahead of most people, but I don't recall the testimony when we came up, and I sat over the budgets of the labs, that is the Department of Energy sections on it, and I didn't get anything on that. So in fairness, things change in America, and they're changing for the best, and now we got some momentum to try and get these solutions. Thank you.
If there are no more questions, we'll just one more thank you for our panel. Really thank you, Senator, for coming. We really appreciate it.